Right, so we've touched on pull rates, we've touched on set sizes, we've touched on how they correlate with one another, but we've never really dived into super rares. So, yeah, I understand that when you hear super rares, the main sentiment is that means Majestics get harder to pull, and therefore that is a bad thing. That's completely understandable, right? But another sentiment to that really needs to be processed is the rates associated to super rares never actually went away, right? So, Welcome to Wraith and Arcane Rising, we had Majestics and super rares. They're the only sets to feature Majestics and super rares before we just got Majestics at the rate of 1 in 4 packs. So, in Welcome to Wraith and Arcane Rising, 10 Majestics, 1 per 12 packs, so that's triple the current rate, and 15 super rares, 1 per 6 packs. So, think of Command & Conquer. Its pull rate as a Majestic is 1 in 12 packs. Then we get to Klloo, and Klloo introduces Majestics at 1 in 4. But we go from 10 Majestics to 36, right? And yes, there were short prints, and we can account for the short prints, but essentially that means that our rate of 1 in 12 for Command & Conquer gets times by 10, because that's the actual pool size of Majestics, versus Crucible, where it's 1 in 4, times 31 when we account for the cards that were short printed. This means that Command & Conquer's effective pull rate is 1 in 20 packs, versus any Majestic of Klloo being 1 in 24. So yes, super rares went away, but their pull rate didn't. It just got adjusted and absorbed thanks to the Majestic pool of cards being bumped up again, triple fold. So while super rares and that effect of making Majestics hard to pull is definitely a bad thing, the other aspect of that is the curation that they offered, right? They curated the pool of Majestics, and there we have the tiered system. So Command & Conquer, being a rightfully powerful Majestic, still had the same effective pull rate as sets nowadays, right? Well, actually, not sets nowadays, sets prior to the expansion slot. But again, the super rare slot pulled away cards from that Majestic pool, right? So in terms of the actual count, again, Welcome to Wraith, Arcane Rising, 10 and 10. Then with Klloo, we jump up to the 30s, and we've sort of maintained around the 30s with some outliers. So, for instance, Everfest at 45, we had the Carnival slot, although the Carnival Majestics didn't obviously make up, say, 15 Majestics. They were sorely less than that, but we also had Heroes introduced as Majestics, and there's all these other tools and tweaks that, again, make it so that we've carried on this rate of around 30 to, say, 35 Majestics in a set, meaning that we've always continued to maintain the rate of super rares, right? Majestics effectively have always been the same as Welcome to Wraith or Arcane Rising. Now, when it comes to the expansion slot or the transitions throughout time, right? So, Welcome to Wraith through Outsiders, we had rares at 1.75. And why this is important is because we can work backwards, right? We know a Majestic replaces a rare, so from that we get our 0.25 or our 1 in 4 for our actual pull rate of Majestic / super rare. So again, effectively, the pool in total is the same, 1 in 4, right? When we combine super rares and Majestics for Welcome to Wraith and Arcane Rising, but we have that curation factor. And then for the actual Majestics, they've also stayed the same due to the actual pool of cards, right? So then we jump to Dusk Till Dawn and Bright Lights, where rares were declared at 1.68, which is a bit of an oddball. So Dusk Till Dawn, we know that the cold foils replaced rares, so that makes up for that 0.07. For Bright Lights, it's a little unsure, but at the very least, I am confident in stating that the limited Majestics, so the non-expand slot Majestics, stayed at our rate of 1 in 4. Then when we get to heavy hitters onwards, well, our rares are now at 1.83, meaning that the remainder for our limited Majestics, since limited Majestics replace rares, expand slot Majestics replace tokens, means that our pull rate for our limited Majestics jumps up to 1 in 5.88 or 5.9 or 6 packs, right? Which again, is very similar to the ratio of super rares, right? 1 in 6. Then for our actual expansion slots, well, we can again reverse engineer. We know that the overall rate stated for Majestics is at 0.25. So if we have our limited Majestics making up 0.17, our expand slot makes up 0.08 or 1 in 12.5 packs. Again, the old rate of Majestics in Welcome to Wraith and Arcane Rising. So overall, what this means is with the loss of super rares, right? The rate was just rolled into Majestics, and now we're actually at a worse point, right? Limited Majestics are harder to pull than normal Majestics were, and our expand slot Majestics are even harder than that. So in totality, all we've lost is the curation element of super rares, and whether or not that was done correctly in Welcome to Wraith or Arcane Rising is not what I'm necessarily here to argue, but it is an element of the game that could definitely benefit, right? If certain things were curated correctly, not in relation to how powerful they are, but how often they need to be pulled, then again, I would say super rares could return and be utilized as an effective rarity class between rares and majestics. Now, the other side of the coin to look at in comparison is our legendaries. So legendaries, Welcome to Rathe through Monarch, 1 in 96. Tails was 1 in 88, right? A little bit of an oddball, but that was to compensate with the increase in the number of legendaries. Then from 2.0, we have our legendaries being split between Rainbow Foil and Cold Foils and being declared. I've also excluded the supplemental sets, since their legendary rate is often skyrocketed due to the lesser quantity, except for Dusk Till Dawn, but Dusk Till Dawn itself is an oddball. But generally speaking, Uprising Outsiders, the Rainbow Foils are more common than they were in previous sets, and the Cold Foils were more sparse, right? To again account for collectability versus playability. Then for Bright Lights, it goes back to just a single declared rate of 1 per 70 packs, and I would highly assume that this 1 per 70 is the lower end, right? This is the Rainbow Foil or the lowest chance to pull a legendary, whereas for heavy hitters onwards, I would say it's a compounded rate, right? So we can use that to try and create an understanding. So the formula to the right there, right? So basically, if we were to say for the heavy hitters that our Rainbow Foil legendaries were still at, say, 70, right? What they were in Outsiders, and again, what I'd assume for Bright Lights, then our Cold Foils would be at 258, and therefore average out to 1 in 96. So overall, even though it has gone down and then back up, we're still at the same starting point as Welcome to Rathe and Arcane Rising when it comes to legendaries. So in terms of how legendaries have been handled in comparison to our majestics, significantly better, right? Super rares taken out, but majestics upped to compensate, right? By way of their actual card pool size. Whereas legendaries were made easier to pull through their Rainbow Foils. So overall, card pool wise, the legendaries have stayed the same, around 5 to 7, generally 6 a set. So this is another reason why whenever we do discuss this sort of topic, I do think LSS is on the right track when it comes to legendaries, but the wrong track when it comes to majestics. So overall, majestics started at 1 in 12, right? But it was a 10 card pull. We then jumped up to 1 in 4, so that is fantastic. That's much better rates to pull majestic, obviously. But then we had a 30 card pull, meaning that they're effectively equivalent. Then, now with the expansion slot, our limited majestics have jumped up to 1.59, which means that now they are, again, harder to pull than that starting point. As for legendaries, 1 in 96, 6 card pull. At its lowest point, 1 in 70. And then, again, however we try to work out heavy hitters onwards with the expansion slot, it's either, again, on par to Welcome to Rathe and Arcane Rising, or most likely still better when it comes to pulling a Rainbow Foil legendary. So majestics, even with the loss of super rares, have gotten the short end of the stick, whereas legendaries have remained on track in terms of still being pullable and collectible, and therefore finding all the correct play pieces. So when it comes to super rares, right, at worst, if they were to return, it would mean we get the same rates, but better curation, right? Cards being pulled out of the majestic pool because they don't quite fit the same power level as some of the top end cards. And then at best, right, which is what I would like to see, is it slot between, right? Not changing the current pull rates, which again have gotten worse from the middle era of Flesh and Blood, but once again serve to better curate the card pool. Now, personally, I would specifically like to see them used to deliver generics at slightly better rates, right? So when it comes to the generics, in a perfect world, everyone wants every card, but that's not what exists, right? In reality, everyone wants basically every generic card that gets printed, especially at the majestic slot, right? But they don't want every class card. Some people might not care at all for the Hunted, for Ninja, Warrior, and Assassin, but they definitely want Shelter from the Storm, and that's where we get that huge pressure on the card. And in that sense, that's where I'd like to see super rares come back. Again, slotting between rares and majestics, preferably not affecting pull rates. But if we're reducing the overall card pool, then pull rates can be reduced as well. So then if it was used to directly deliver generics, it means that generics would be slightly more commonplace, and therefore more accessible to everyone who wants them versus the demand on specific class cards, right? So that is my understanding of super rares, and where the idea of super rares returning to Fab isn't a bad thing. Again, the needle hasn't moved, right? Super rares was removed, but LSS compensated by way of the card pool for majestics, and they've maintained that ever since. And now again with the expansion slot, although the joined rate between the expansion slot and the limited majestics evens out to our 1 in 4, it means that the inset majestics have become harder to pull along with the expansion slot. So to me personally, there would be no downside unless right? And this is the worst case scenario. Super rares are just the crop of rare cards, in which case then it is utter trash. But that was never the case, right? Super rares were always Majestics, or it's more concise to say that all super rares became Majestics, right? So yeah, that's my perspective when it comes to super rares. Well, it's completely understandable that we don't want Majestics to become harder than they are, right? Because that's definitely the wrong direction we want to see the game going, and unfortunately it has continued in that trajectory. Super rares returning for the point of curation, I think, would be a nice factor for the game, especially when, again, it comes to those cards that see higher than usual demand in relation to everything else. Not every assassin player wants ninja cards. Not every ninja player wants assassin cards, but they probably both want shelters, right? Anyway, that's my summation for super rares. Hope that offers some clarity, right? What do you think? Hope you enjoyed. See ya.